Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Prison Post Policy Hour. My name is Ken Oliver, your host, Business Development Director at the Crop Organization. We're here today to talk policy, California policy, national policy. I have a very esteemed guest, Mr. Michael Mendoza, who is the Director of National Advocacy at the Anti-Recidivist Coalition. How you doing, Michael?
Great, Ken. You're too kind, my brother. Just a pleasure to be here with you.
Absolutely. It's good to see you again. I know Michael from my policy work when I was at LSPC as the policy director there, and we've done a lot of advocacy both in the state and with other organizations. So it's a pleasure to have you. Good to see you again. I consider you a friend, and I'm just glad you're here today to speak to the
Likewise,
people
bro. Likewise.
and talk about some of the criminal justice reform going on in California. I guess for our listeners that don't know you, like I do, I think you have a very interesting story and background, and I'd be interested in learning and having our listeners learn about your background, how you got involved with the criminal justice reform movement, how you got justice involved, and just tell us a little bit about how you grew up and your background.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, Ken. I mean, quite honestly, my story is not unique. Unfortunately, it's very similar amongst our Black and Brown brothers and sisters within the criminal justice space. And that's exactly what I am. I'm a brown kid that grew up in Southern California during the mid '90s. When Pete Wilson was our governor and President Clinton was signing the tough on crime bill that allowed kids as young as 14 to be tried as adults. And growing up in poverty, unfortunately, I made some really bad decisions that led me the wrong way. Where I found myself standing before a judge at the age of 15,
Wow.
being tried and sentenced as an adult, and being told that I was going to spend the rest of my life in adult prison. And it was one of the most hopeless moments in my entire life. I was trying to figure out how my first 15 years of existence in this world led to that moment. Like, what did I do, and what's going on here? And I quickly learned a rough lesson real quick, as entering into the adult criminal justice system, being told by mostly everyone around me that I was never going to go home. Get used to this, little homie, because this is going to be the rest of your life.
Right.
And so I entered into the adult institution with that mentality. I was 17 years old in 1998, Calipatch State Prison. It was on and cracking in those
Gladiator
days,
school.
gladiator school, and riots kicking off, my first time in the prison yards. And that was a rude awakening I had. And, with the anger and the hopelessness that that the message that I received from the rest of the community kind of fueled me in that direction. And unfortunately, that was my life for the next 10 years while I was serving my incarceration, until policy saved my life. It wasn't just policy that saved my life. It was a few loved ones that I had still in my corner there, telling me that and encouraging me to do the best I can to change. And I would always do the best I can and hit walls. And even when I would go to the board and hit that denial, and it was just always so discouraging, until this beautiful woman came into my life that we all know by the name of Elizabeth Calvin.
Elizabeth. Shout out
Right?
to Elizabeth.
Shout out to Elizabeth
Human
Calvin.
Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch, exactly. I remember getting a letter from her, from HRW, asking me about my age and how old I was, and just things that I believe nobody really cared about. Um, and when she was telling me about this law that could possibly change and give me hope and be able to prove that I was no longer that 15-year-old kid anymore, I couldn't believe it. But yet I did everything I could to make sure that the next time I went to the board, that I was going to show them that I was no longer that 15-year-old kid anymore.
Sure.
That I had built a life, and then I was prepared to go home. And sure enough, when SB 260 passed in 2013, and I was one of the first ones to go to the board when it was enacted the next year, it was just such a different hearing than the ones before. They actually took my age into consideration, and they actually saw that I had, grown and matured. Um, and I paroled in 2014, and it was one of the biggest moments in my life. I went on to get my BA degree in political science at SF State University, because once I saw how policy can change lives and save lives and give people hope, I wanted to do the exact same thing.
Sure.
I wanted to change laws and provide people hope that I left behind, that I knew no longer belong there.
Sure. I want to go back just a minute and touch on something that you brought up, because we at Crop talk a lot about uh, changing the mindset for yourself when you're in the prison environment and taking the lid off of the possibilities that exist, and how we oftentimes, when we go to prison, especially when we're young, we buy into this mindset of the way that it is on the prison yard for gang culture, for racial culture, et cetera, and so forth. And it's really alienating and self-destructive in so many ways. And we tend to feel that sense of hopelessness and that this is our life. We don't have a choice. But really the contrary is true. And so I'm interested in hearing from you when you reach that moment from going to places like Calipatra and level 4 prisons, when you had that moment in your life when you knew that there was a possibility for something more or greater for yourself.
That's a great question. And there's this memory I have that I'll never forget. I was in Soledad State Prison. It was my first level 3. I was still doing things I wasn't supposed to do. And I woke up one day and I saw myself looking in the mirror, and I no longer knew who I was anymore. I couldn't tell who I had become since that 15-year-old kid that was arrested. But one thing I was starting to realize in the game I was playing was that if I continued to do the same thing I was doing, thinking the same way I was thinking, and progressing in the same way I was progressing, I was going to either end up dead or in the shoe for the rest of my life.
Sure.
And it's not what I wanted, nor was it what I wanted for my friends and comrades around me, because I knew that deep down inside there was a better alternative that we can get to and work towards if we can get around and grow past the trauma that we all faced. Because one thing that I have learned, that we have all learned, is that it's a traumatic experience doing time in a system that is so ingrained with institutional racism, not just within our own groups, but even within the institution and the state itself.
Sure.
And that's what we have to battle all the time.
Absolutely. Well, I just think that, it's amazing that you were able to reach that point where you knew that there was something else for yourself. And I think that everybody in the prison environment, I'm a firm believer that nobody wants the situation that exists internally. I mean, I've had conversations with people that claim to be Aryan Brotherhoods and they were like a friend. I've had conversations with people that thought that they were so entrenched in, gang culture, Mexican mafia or NF or whoever. And normally when they're in that crowd, they can't speak to you because they're black, or black can't speak to whoever. But then when you get in these private moments, whether they're at work or in the shoe fishing or whatever, this other humanity comes out, right? The real person where they're willing to talk sports with you, girlfriends, family life, et cetera, and so forth. So it always dawned on me that a lot of that was a veneer. And so many of us, just to get along, buy into that veneer. And so I just think it's worth commending you on the fact that at some point you broke through that veneer and decided on having a different future for yourself. And ultimately that's what led to get you out of prison. What I'd like to do is transition a little bit into the work that you do, because a lot of people don't know the tremendous work. I know personally because I've been in it with you, but I want everyone who's listening to know about the tremendous work Michael has done, how he got there, right? Because I'm interested in knowing how you landed at a place like ARC when you got out, how you got into policy, what your trajectory was like, because I think it's important to tell that story. So can you tell us how you got to ARC when you first got out and that whole story?
Most definitely. One of my favorite stories that begins with one of my true heroes, Elizabeth Calvin, who wrote the bill, SB 260, that gave me the opportunity to fight for my freedom. And when I came home and she had asked me, I'm going to be working on some more bills, to try to improve this for other youth. And she asked me, she's like, I need help. And in my mind, how could I not come to the side of somebody who saved my life and fight alongside them to help save others,
Sure.
knowing how powerful that was. And so there I was, even though I was working full time, even though I was going to SF State University full time, sometimes I ditched class just to go to Sacramento, California and advocate on certain bills.
Right,
Sometimes I would tell, my employers while I was working in a factory, bagging up groceries or vegetables that, I had some really important things I wanted to do in terms of civic engagement, to share my voice, to share my story. And, I don't regret doing any of it because, with Elizabeth Calvin and through Elizabeth Calvin, I then met Scott Budnick, my dear friend, a dear friend to us all, who founded the Anti-Recidivism
absolutely.
Coalition
Shout
in
out to Scott.
2013.
Shout out to Scott.
Big shout out
He's
to
led
Scott.
a lot of this work, this reform work. Probably wouldn't have taken the trajectory that it has over the last 10 years without Scott and the wonderful work he's done.
Exactly. It's been two of the most amazing individuals who recognize the value of our youth and how we need to invest in our youth and how our system was failing our youth. And so, getting involved with ARC at a very early stage in 2014, I remember Scott took us to the White House for the very first time when Obama was there.
Wow.
And it was the very first time that the White House had ever had around 15 so-called felons into the White House at the same time.
Wow.
And it was just an eye-opening experience for not just me, but the other members who were there. And it's an example of how when people who are out here who are not system impacted embrace people who are reentering into the communities and give them experiences that they've never had before, what it does to just wake up that fire
right
within you to be a part of your community. And that's what they are really good at, is they're good at not leading it by standing in front of folks, but by pushing folks in front of them.
Sure.
And leading behind them. And that's what they've done. That's what we've built at ARC, where, now we have an organization that not just provides direct services for people coming home, opportunities for housing, jobs and education, but opportunities to advocate. Sure. Because that's what we're doing in California for the last 10 years, being able to pass bills, amazing bills with other amazing partners like All of Us or None, Human Rights Watch, just so many amazing individuals in this space that we try to fight alongside with for the most important reason and the goal that we all want, as that arc bends, right?
Absolutely.
And so for me, it was just a no-brainer to get involved in this advocacy work because it taught me how to work alongside with anybody, regardless of they're formerly incarcerated or not, because that's what we need in this space. Sure. We need all hands on deck to undo the generations of systemic oppression that we face today. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to continue to be a journey for us.
Sure. I want to go back and you said something that was so poignant and something that I advocate every chance that I get, which is almost every day, to talk about the importance of those experiences that light fires in front of people. Because we come from communities in many cases that don't have a lot of experiences outside of our sandbox, whether that's in South Central LA or in a place like East Oakland or the Tenderloins in Frisco or any other impoverished neighborhood across California. Typically, when we grow up and we see our environment, we're confined to what we see in those places. And I try to explain to people that allowing someone who's never seen anything to see and touch and smell something else, like your trip to the White House, or maybe a program at Cal Berkeley, or maybe, a Sacramento Kings basketball game, or going to work out with the Lakers, for example. How transformational that is because for many of us, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but for many of us, I know from experience, who go through the criminal justice system, we've already been traumatized before we even get to the door, through the life experiences that we've had in many cases. And then when we get through the door of prison, we're traumatized even further. And we're constantly being told that we have a lid on who we are, that we fit into these small boxes of stereotypical stuff, right? And we start to believe a lot of that stuff. I mean, I've sat in groups with grown men, people that have done a lot of things that people would say were terrible, gang members, et cetera, and watch them recall or recount an experience when they were 7 with their father or mother or uncle, and they'd well up with tears, right? And so I knew watching these experiences that, a lot of us had arrested development, right? We stopped being kids when we were young and we started hitting the streets and we were forced to become men, or in the case of women, grown women. And so I'm so glad that you said something about being exposed to experiences, because that is transformational. Can you tell me just a little bit about your own personal experience going to the White House, meeting Obama, being in that environment? What did that do for you as a formerly incarcerated person?
You know, that was an amazing experience that I just hope to not just duplicate for others, but continue to do. And, you know, it reminded me as you were mentioning this topic about how important it is and why we even fight for communities to be resourced, right? Because at the issue of what you're talking about is the issue of people in poverty being under resourced in their communities in a way that doesn't provide these opportunities for our youth or people of color, you know, through schools and education. Because you and I both know and remember that going to school, you know, we may have missed one of those sixth grade field trips because we didn't have the
Right.
money, or, you know, just looking at the way we were fed lunches
Right.
with how much of money we were getting into our education. You know, that's the battle that we fight on the micro level and the macro level for us, in terms of the narrative, where it's always a challenge to gain access, exposure into opportunities that, you know, everybody should be exposed to, regardless of your background or where you come from. And when we are able to gain those experiences and bring others alongside with you who've never had them before, it just builds up this fire and this hope of what is possible.
Sure.
Because many of the times we're only limited to the experiences we have, and that means we limit what is possible because
Right.
we can't see the bigger picture. And so I fully believe that when we are able to provide experiences to anyone, um, regardless of the background or what they've gone through, that it allows them
Sure.
to think bigger, and to reach for those North Star goals that normally we wouldn't reach to because we wouldn't think to be possible.
Right.
So, at what point would I have ever thought that I'd be standing inside the White House after
Right.
doing all of that time, after being called a super predator, a murderer, and all of those things? Never in my wildest dreams would I thought I'd be there.
Sure.
And now that I've experienced it, now it might be even possible that one day I might be able to work there.
Right.
You know, so it does wonders for our people, and I think it's something that we need to continue to fight for and make sure that communities are a resource to provide those opportunities to our young ones.
And we see that we've seen that even in the CBO community, right? Where you see so many people that are formerly incarcerated whose lives have been transformed just to be able to do the work, whether it's organizing, whether it's policy, whether it's housing, whether it's being, you know, certified alcohol and drug counselors. You see a whole new light in the same human beings that on the prison yard may have looked dead, so to speak, right? And so the opportunity to get into a career, the opportunity to do meaningful work, the opportunity to get paid like you're supposed to get paid and be able to pay your own rent. There's a dignity that comes with that. There's a hope that comes with that. And it's very redemptive. And I just think that's amazing uh, of what you did at the White House or what you were able to experience. And, you know, I would encourage people who have the opportunity to provide experiences for people that's a major component of transformation is exposure. Studies in science have said it for years, is that, you know, people typically become what they're exposed to. And so the more you're exposed to, you know, the more diverse you can become and the more opportunities you have. So I appreciate you sharing that piece. So let's transition a little bit away from that and go into criminal justice reform in California.
Here we go.
And let's talk a little bit. I mean, me and you have been involved in the work for the last year or so, and you longer than I. Why in 2020, given the pandemic, given unemployment and all of the other problems that California faces, because we know that we face a lot of problems currently, not to mention what's going on nationally at the White House, right? And some of the other stuff. Why is criminal justice reform important, and why should people who aren't involved in the criminal justice system per se directly be concerned with criminal justice reform in California? What are some of the consequences? What are some of the reasons we should be paying attention to this stuff?
Yeah, I'll tell you why. But first, I want to correct something you said. You said that I've been in this work longer than you have. And I think that one of the things I want to encourage people to understand is that just because I've been out here longer than you doesn't mean that I've been doing this work longer than you. Many of us started this work the day we were
It's
incarcerated.
true.
And so I know you just as well as others were fighting from the inside as most of us were fighting out here. So we've been doing this together for
I
a lot longer
appreciate
than
that,
you
brother. I
think, brother.
appreciate that.
But in terms of your question, 2020 is huge. Um, I mean, let me just paint a bigger picture of nationally how huge 2020 is in the presidency. I mean, I don't even know how much I need to say on the presidency and how important that is. But we're also talking about, the U.S. Supreme Court justice who's going to take that seat and how important that is, and laws that are going to be tried to establish and made or changed after that. But when we come back to California and the elections, we're not just looking at elected officials, assembly members, senators. We're looking at DA races, and most importantly, we're looking at propositions,
Sure.
veto referendums, ballot initiatives um, that really want to undo and roll back some of the most recent and important wins that we have seen in the last 30 years. I'm talking about 30 years. And what I mean by 30 years is in California, if you look back at the last five governors, starting with Pete Wilson, nothing was moving then. The only thing that moved was Brown versus Plata, a decision that a three-court judge made to reduce the prison population. Why? Because it became so overcrowded that the conditions were inhumane and cruel and unusual, violating our constitutional rights of human beings.
Men and women were dying.
That's how bad it got. You remember that?
Sure.
That's how bad it got. And we still didn't see any remedies till years later after 2011. I can go on and we can talk about, after 2011, Brown versus Plata, how we saw, SB 260 in 2013, Prop 47, AB 109, Prop
Sure.
57. We
Sure.
saw a lot of important things that the state tried to do to address the three-court judge ruling. So many things were done showing that we needed to reduce the prison population based on that ruling because of how overcrowded it was. I mean, at one point, I remember it got so bad that I was sleeping on a triple bunk.
Right.
I mean, I basically had to like crawl my way into the middle rack of a bunk,
Right.
just to.
Well, wait a minute, Mike. A lot of people don't know what a triple bunk is. Can you explain what a triple bunk is, especially in a place like the gym or a day room, and what that looks like?
Right. And so if you imagine what a normal bunk bed looks like, you have a bed on the bottom, and immediately on top of that bed, you have a bed on top, a regular bunk bed. Imagine if you extend it just a little bit more and you add a bed right in the middle
Right.
of the top rack,
Right.
top bed, or the bottom bed. And there's just, it confines you even more. And then when you imagine that triple bunk bed, whether it's, in a cubicle, whether it's in a gymnasium, and with 5 or 10 of them all around you, that's how overcrowded it got. That's
Sure.
how bad conditions got. And so the state did everything they could to address it. And I think at that moment, there was a shift in the narrative too, where California started to begin and realize that punishment was not the answer.
Sure.
Being tough on crime was not the answer. And they started to dig into their values of what mercy and hope and grace looked like within the criminal justice system. And so we had major wins like Prop 57, that allowed people inside to earn credits and gave them some hope to come home sooner, but also changed the face of the juvenile justice system and giving judges discretion on whether youth should be tried as adults or not. And that's what the voters voted for.
Sure.
They voted for rehabilitation. And now in 2020, we're at a very, very dangerous point where some say that we have gone too far. And those who say that we have gone too far are mostly law enforcement. And unfortunately, the fact of the matter is, we had just made these wins, so we even haven't had enough time to show how important they are. Except for the fact that now crime rates are low, and people who are considered violent offenders who have been released through the parole board, governed by the California governor, those who have been released have the lowest recidivism rates out of all populations.
Absolutely.
Less than 3% ever go back to prison. And so we have a lot of data, not just in recidivism rates, but brain science and youth and development and how important programs are. And in 2020, we have uh, a ballot initiative, Prop 20, that can take all that away if people don't vote no on Prop 20. And so it's not just about voting no on Prop 20 to protect our wins of what public safety should really look like,
Sure.
but it's about voting, period, for elected officials and for your champions that know what criminal justice reform is about. And that's what is at stake here in 2020.
Right. I want to get into some of the propositions because there's a lot of talk about propositions. There's a lot of things that the governor just recently signed into law. We're going to get to that, but I want to go back a little bit and discuss or flush out a little bit about why criminal justice reform is so important in the state and across this country. And I think some of the conversations have to be centered on whether we want to continue as a community, right, as a state, as a nation, to buy into this retributive model, this eye for eye, tooth for tooth, when most of us in our daily lives don't believe in that. We tell our kids, don't go out there and look for retribution or revenge, find other ways to get the job done. But yet in our criminal justice system for so long, and you prefaced the 90s earlier, we were on, like, if a person does X, we want to lock them up and throw away the key. It got so bad at one point we were taking 14-year-old kids who haven't even entered high school, and we were putting them in adult prisons, right, and giving them life sentences. And so I think it's important for Californians to understand and reflect on whether we want to be about personal transformation of people and human beings, men and women, regardless of an act that they've committed or a mistake that they've made, or whether we want to get into and stay into the retributive model. The retributive model has been shown, as you mentioned, to be harmful. It doesn't redeem people. It doesn't transform people. In fact, it further traumatizes people. And so, even though the emotional response is someone broke in my car, lock them up, et cetera, we know that those policies don't work because they cost taxpayers a lot of money. I think CDC's budget is $15 billion a year this year. Law enforcement in this state hovers over $40 or $50 billion a year. So it's really about finding other models of transformation. You and I do this work, so we see the transformation that takes place when you actually embrace people rather than have that retribution revenge type model and push people further away and alienate them rather than embrace them. So I think that's very important. And I appreciate, you touching on that and talking about why that's important. Now, in reference to the propositions, right? A lot of hot button topics going on in criminal justice in the next month or so at the ballot box. And as you mentioned, we encourage everybody to vote. I'm going to throw that out there right up front, and we're going to talk about why that's important. And the first one I want to talk about is Proposition 17.
Free the vote.
Free the vote 2020, which was previously ACA 6, a constitutional amendment to allow people who have served their time and gotten out of prison to vote, even though they may be under supervision in the form of parole. Why is that important for 50,000, which isn't a big number when you look at the California population? Why do you think that's important for people to give folks back the franchise of voting, and why is voting important in general?
When I think about Prop 17 and I think about voting rights, all I can do is remember that this is about people that have finished their prison terms, that are re-entering society, trying to navigate beyond the barriers that impact people with felony convictions, on top of being on supervision, and really just trying to create a life for themselves by finding a job, working, paying taxes. But the most important part about that process for folks reentering, to add to that, is the ability to vote.
Having a voice.
And I learned, I never knew how important that was until I started to get into advocacy, until I started to learn about the responsibility that our elected officials have, that we elect into office to do what's in our best interest, because our tax paying dollars pay for what they do to protect the resources we need and the opportunities we need for a sustainable living and safe environment. And so if I'm out here paying taxes and I want to share my voice and talk about what's important to me and my community from my family, I can't do that without voting.
Absolutely.
And it's even more important for people coming home because it's a form of civic engagement gets that gives somebody a reason to learn about the laws that are being changed and the people that are being voted on, because it impacts them where they live and it impacts their family.
Who's representing them?
Exactly. And so if we can't represent ourselves, if we can't represent our loved ones who can't vote, and we don't have the opportunity to vote because of a felony conviction, even though we've served our time, that is not just.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting, for people, who are nationalists or people that really believe um, in the agency of Americanism and understanding how America was formed, no taxation without representation, when they seceded from the British. And, that notion, no taxation without representation, meant that we don't believe we should be paying you tax if we're not represented equally, right? And yet here we are 400 years later in 2020, and we still have people paying taxes, right, in the form of parolees, people that are, doing the right thing. They're working, they're going to school, they're taking their kids, they're raising, they're doing all that other stuff. And they're being taxed by not only by the state of California, but they're being taxed heavily by the government, right? And they're paying those taxes. Yet they don't have a voice in what goes on in their community. They don't have a voice in what goes on in their state, and they don't have a voice in what goes on nationally. And to me, the contradiction or the hypocrisy in that policy of having the founding fathers of this country writing no taxation without representation, then we're doing it 400 years later to a subset of a population. And so I think that we all need to reflect on that when we talk about the history of America and the importance of being taxed and being able to have a voice in the process of what goes on, whether it be for your local sheriff or whether it be for a district attorney, a school board seat, in some cases, a board of supervisors. Those things are important because those elected officials and those laws have impact, especially locally, on what happens in your daily life. And if you're a law-abiding citizen, doesn't matter that at one time you made a mistake, you paid your debt to the state, right? This California Supreme Court has stated that parole is not part of the prison sentence. The highest court in the land, I mean, in California, has said that. And so if the highest court in California has said that the prison sentence ends the day that you get out, then there's no reason in the world that we should be withholding the right to vote for men and women in California. So that's very important. When I was doing voting rights work with ACA 6 earlier in the year, what I found interesting and didn't know was how close some of these races really are. Some of these congressional races and local races oftentimes are won by 200 or 300 votes, 100 votes,
Very
80
close.
votes, very close races. And so, the opportunity to vote can really change the trajectory of what happens locally for some of these communities, right? And I like to always point to the state of Florida, when they passed a couple of years ago the right for felons to vote again, and now they're trying to uphold it with polling taxes, et cetera. But what's interesting when you think back to 2000, when Bush and Gore had the hanging Chad scenario, and I think the final count was 400 or 500 votes separated who became president of the United States. In Florida, there was 1.5 million people that couldn't vote because they had a conviction. Think about the trajectory of the country, whether we went to war in Iraq, what happened in the Middle East, et cetera. It's very, very important to understand that dynamic and why that's important. So Prop 17, we have a lot of advocates out there that are pushing for Prop 17, ARC being one of them, Initiate Justice, All of Us or None, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, Courage, it goes on and on. But there are some opponents that talk about people not being able to vote who are on parole. And it was interesting, I was listening to the senator during the debates during ACA 6, I think it was Nielsen, who was talking about the victims when it comes to voting. And so, one really has nothing to do with the other, because we never want to demean or belittle or not give proper honor and credit to the victims of transgressions in society, no matter who does them. I mean, whether somebody's convicted or not, that's very important. But it really doesn't have anything to do with voting. Can you tell me what you think about that and how some politicians find these or manufacture these things almost, it seems like, out of spite, or like that retributive model we were talking about?
And it's interesting when you hear those arguments, especially in the legislature, and you understand where they fundamentally come from. It's a divisive argument. It's an argument that doesn't consider one thing, which comes to the core values of what we believe in this country, which is to be inclusive and that democracy needs everyone. And when somebody has served their time and finished their time, that's it. They've done their time and should be allowed to participate in what this country is so good at or should be good at, and that is democracy. And so, regardless of the comments that opponents will make and whether they believe it, what they believe in, I think the most important thing for us is just to continue to, meet people where they're at, and
Sure.
that's where we're at in this country with criminal justice reform, and that's why it's such a at a slow place, is because we have just so many hearts and minds to change from that negative stereotype that has been placed on us for generations,
Sure.
being people of color. And so I think at the end of the day, unfortunately, I'm just going to say it's still racism that would encourage anyone to think that people who are out here working and paying their taxes should not vote because of a mistake they made in their past, even though they're doing the complete opposite and contributing to their communities and their societies. It's a question of values and ethics, and it just goes to show how much more work we need to do in this country and
Right.
in this state to get beyond that and to work together and really create a democracy
Yeah.
that is for everyone.
Interestingly enough, some of these people that make these arguments, they typically don't make the arguments about victims when it comes to the indigenous Native American populations, stuff that they went through, right? It's kind of a one-sided lens. But let's talk a little bit about Proposition 20. It's given all of us scares, fits, and in this community about the possibility of rolling back. You alluded to it earlier. A lot of the positive reforms that have occurred over the last 10 years. I mean, California's been able to reduce its prison population just over the last several years by about 30,000, 40,000 people. The governor just recently declared he's going to close a couple prisons. He's closing DJJ, the youth prison. So we'll actually be able to use and repurpose those facilities for something better for our youth and for our community members, and find other ways to deal with them. But yet you have this segment, kind of what we just spoke about, of people who I like to call opportunists, political opportunists, who will take something and twist it, shape shift it into something else in order to win hearts and minds. A lot of people may not know about Proposition 20. Can you just touch on it a little bit and why it's important for us in the fall in the criminal justice movement to defeat something like Prop 20?
Yeah, so Prop 20 is a ballot initiative. It's an initiative that would basically is supported by all law enforcement. You got most law enforcement supporting it. And when you read the intent of the ballot, it wants to do several things. And I think the heart of it is to take California back to being tough on crime. And when you look at that, when California was tough on crime, we had the most overcrowded prisons. We had, youth of color, especially Black youth of color, being arrested 5 times more than their white counterpart. We had kids being tried as young as 14 and 15-year-olds as adults. That was California being tough on crime. That's what Proposition 20 wants to do. Prop 20 wants to take us back to being tough on crime by saying, if it's right now the law is if you steal or if you steal $950, even if you use a credit card and steal $950, you can be charged with a misdemeanor or a felony. They want to bring that down to $250. And let's just say we have a mother and a child or a family who are in need and they're desperate. They have a credit card and they steal $250 worth of groceries. They want to be able to convict them not just for possibly a felony.
Sure.
And so we're talking about punishing, the poor, and looking at um, law in a way that would punish the poor for, things that are
Economic crimes.
economic crimes. And so not just that, but they also want to take 51 misdemeanors and change them into felonies. And so again, we're at the heart of it. We're talking about over punishing. We're talking about that retributive model that there's no room for mercy. There's no room for giving people a way to kind of, what is, how are we going to govern our people here? Are we going to
Sure.
be tough on crime, or are we going to look at different ways to how to help folks who are making bad decisions? And so unfortunately, this would roll back efforts that have been won in AB 109, Prop 57. And, we've come a long way. And to allow Prop 20 to pass and taking us back to an era that did nothing good for us
Sure.
in terms of public safety is why we have to vote no on Prop 20.
It's reactionary politics at its best, right? And what's interesting, what I wanted to point out, you mentioned the 250 number, $250, which basically is a pair of Jordans for a kid, 18 years old, who might go to prison under Proposition 20. What's interesting to me is that as a state, we spend about $80,000 a year to keep a man or a woman incarcerated, and for juveniles, that number jumps up to like $400,000 a year. And so you have to question, I think, right? How much sense does it make that somebody steals $200 worth of property, $500 worth of property, even $1,000 worth of property? We're going to spend 80 times more per year. So if a person gets a 3-year sentence, we're going to spend $240,000, $250,000 to lock somebody up who stole $950 worth of property. Now, we're not saying that that shouldn't be addressed, right? The fact of the theft and the $950 and the ability to restore that is an issue, and that's a different conversation. The question is, as you mentioned, are we going to over incarcerate, over police, and then overspend? I mean, one of the reasons that I think we got to this place in criminal justice reform is because in the 90s, as you mentioned, under Pete Wilson, it was like, even if a person stole a slice of pizza, give them a life sentence, right? If they had a strike or two. And it cost a lot of money, right? Over the course of 20, 25 years, it cost $1 million to lock each person up. Multiply that times 180,000, I think. CDC was at a peak, and it can't be sustained.
Exactly. And you know what? As you were saying something, it just made me think about the fact that, back in the days, punishment was punishing people physically. And as the law evolved, it now punishes people with felonies. Felony convictions are one of the hardest things to get off of your record.
Sure.
And so if we're now deciding to punish people from misdemeanors to felonies and tagging them for the rest of their lives, when these are for nonviolent crimes that we're talking about.
Sure.
And we want to tag people with a felony conviction that will exclude them from so many opportunities that people need just to have life and opportunity. That's not the direction we want to go in. And so that's when we think about that, we actually are going backwards with Prop 20 by tagging more people with felony convictions. When they're still human beings, they have the opportunity to grow, to mature, to be redeemed, and change their lifestyle. Unfortunately, felony convictions are hard to shake off, and so it's another example of why, this proposition that we have to vote no on is just another tool of mass incarceration we don't need.
Absolutely. I was reading, and I just want to touch back before we go to Prop 25 about the 80,000 number. I was reading a report, I think it was by the PPIC or another group, and they talked about that $80,000 number, but then they juxtaposed that with how much was actually spent on a person's rehabilitation. And so the amount for the rehabilitation, I think, was like $500 to $1,000, somewhere up in that range per person, but $80,000 a year to lock that person up. And so Prop 20, interestingly enough, wants to over criminalize again, continue to go back to that model to lock more people up. And they're not talking about the cost of doing that and whether that's worth it, and whether we should be throwing away human capital and human potential for those large sums of money over relatively minor economic crimes. Again, not to dismiss, the importance of those things, but typically people reach out for economic crimes out of desperation or what they feel like is desperation. And it forces them in a position to reach in a way that they may not normally if their economic situation was different. So I appreciate that piece. On to Prop 25, which is a bail initiative. I know that's dear to your heart. I'd like for you to talk about it and why it's important and tell people what it's about.
Yes. So Prop 25, what Prop 25 basically does is it ends money bail by completely getting rid of the bail industry out of California. California would be the first state in the entire country to completely get rid of the bail industry if we vote yes on Prop 25. At the same time, what it will do is replace the bail industry with a risk assessment tool that I myself don't even like. I've been judged by risk assessments my whole entire life, even while I was incarcerated, although a different type of life, even although a different type of risk assessment tool, um, is still a tool nevertheless that can be inaccurate, that will always have work to be done. But when I look at Prop 25 and Prop 25 is what's called a veto referendum. And what a veto referendum is that people can collect enough signatures if they have the money to do it, because it
Sure.
costs a lot of money to collect
A
signatures.
lot of money in California.
But in this case, the American bail industry had a lot of money to put behind this and collected enough signatures to say, we want the voters to decide whether SB 10 that the governor of California, Governor Brown, passed, and current governor Newsom, who was lieutenant governor at the time, endorsed as well as the entire leadership in our California state, assembly members and senators, our Democratic leadership. They all voted. They all supported SB 10. And so the bail industry said, well, actually, let's allow our voters to decide if you, as the California leaders, are right by passing SB 10.
Sure.
And I was the policy director of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition at the time, working on SB 10 on its second year with a bunch of other amazing advocates. And it was a difficult thing to come to conclusion to because a lot of us couldn't get around the risk assessment part. But when I would take it back to our organization and to the members of our organization who were formerly incarcerated, there were several things that stood out to us formerly incarcerated folks, especially me personally. And one is that when I go back to my own arrest, where at the age of 15, they posed $1 million bail on me. And obviously that was something I couldn't afford. But how is it that if another kid in the same situation whose parents did have $1 million were able to bail him out, but not me, what kind of argument is that when it comes to innocent until proven guilty? What kind of picture does that paint when we're providing a system that's based on money and not the facts? And so for me, when we looked at SB 10, especially for the women in our organization who would always tell me that sometimes we would be arrested for working for pimps, and in juvenile hall their pimps would bail them out right away and put them back on the streets.
Sure.
And in their mind, all they wanted was just to stay incarcerated in juvenile hall so they didn't have to continue to do that. We're talking about getting rid of a tool or a mechanism of mass incarceration, which is the bail industry. And we're talking about trying to move this state, this incarceration system, one that really is about innocent until proven guilty. And yes, the risk assessment is not perfect. The bill is not perfect. But one thing I do know, one thing I have seen throughout the history of California is that we can improve things legislatively.
Sure.
And the bigger thing that we needed to prioritize was first and foremost getting rid of one of the strongest companies in this country, which is the bail industry.
Sure. I want to peel back the layer. I gotta give you a little pushback because I hear it from my brothers and sisters out there who talk about risk assessments. Everything you said about the economic disadvantages of bail is accurate. I don't think anybody would question that. I think that on the surface and what was indicative from 2018 when the SB 10 passed, everybody was in favor of it. But I'm hearing from people on the streets and people out there in the community that, wait a minute, risk assessments are racially biased. Risk assessments take data that biases and weighs against people who live in the inner city, based on race, based on the amount of police contacts, based on a whole slew of factors that disadvantage Latinos and Blacks. And so what's interesting to me is that you have this community of people that do social impact work up and down the state, right? San Diego to Pelican Bay, all good people, all want to do the right thing, all want to advance criminal justice reform. But there seems to be this divide, this divisiveness between the economic impact and the social, racial impact. What do you say to people who challenge the notion that we should sacrifice one for the other, and who, in essence, want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with SB 10?
I mean, I love disagreements. There's nothing wrong with that. It's what's healthy within our community. What's not healthy is when we take those disagreements externally and we can't have those conversations as to what would be the most appropriate, the bail industry or a risk assessment. Um, and unfortunately, there's a lot of times where when we look at the politics in it and we look at the opportunity we had under Governor Jerry Brown, who was leaving office, and the appetite that we had in the legislature, when you understand that and the opportunity, basically to take the advantage and to really disarm the criminal justice system by taking away one of its tools that have really taken advantage of our people for decades. I want to take that opportunity every time, because what was left, yes, a risk assessment was left, and yes, they can be administered, uh, with racial bias. It's not the math that's going to be racially biased. It's
Sure.
the people who administer them. Those are the people we'll be watching, and that is why even Hertzberg passed SB 36 the
Sure.
year after.
What is that SB 36?
So it's to make sure that we follow the data. I'll just be clear. We're going to follow the data, and we're going to see how people are being assessed through these tools and whether it is racially biased or not. And when the data comes out, which won't lie, and we'll have enough of that will collect this time, we can actually see and say, you know what, this is where it needs to be fixed, or you know what, it's not working out. Let's come back and make sure that it does what it's supposed to do, and not detain more people than it actually
Sure.
is predicting to by opposition. The fact of the matter is, when you look at the rest of the country and what Washington has done,
New
when you look
Jersey.
at what New Jersey has done, they have implemented the same measures that that SB 10 have. And they're actually seeing a decline in pretrial detention when you look at the research. And this research was done by Harvard.
Sure.
And so I would just say that, it's a big move that this entire country can learn from, in terms of, getting rid of the most important thing, which is the bail industry, and working with what we have now together.
Sure.
But if we don't do it together, if we continue to have external divisive conversations externally that hurt our movement, and we can't stand together,
Right.
it's going to be harder to fix. And that's, unfortunately, this is the moment where we're at. And unfortunately, if we do not support and vote yes on Prop 25, then what we're telling our elected officials that they made the wrong decision. And not only that, but we're also doing what happened in New York. There was a rollback in New York's pre-trial detention reform.
Sure.
And if we have a rollback on the East Coast, and if we have a rollback on the West Coast, imagine what opponents are going to say now, and how that's going to hurt us in this movement when we've been progressing moving forward.
And more people are going to be locked up. We only have a couple minutes, Michael. I want to close with two things that maybe you can take us out with. A, I want to know what you think the future of California criminal justice reform looks like. And then I want to know what's next for you, because in reality, I want to hear about what your plans are, what your vision is, where you see yourself, some of your goals, objectives, and how you're going to help us get over some of these humps in the state of California.
I wish I was smart enough to predict what California is going to look like. All I can say is it's going to be up to the voters out there to decide this November 3rd. We have a very, very important DA race in LA that I'm keeping my close eye on, and I know everyone else is. That race can literally change the face of California and criminal justice reform.
You're not suggesting they should throw out Jackie Lacey, are you?
I like what you're saying. But what I'm going to say is, LA County being one of the biggest counties with the biggest county jail in the entire country would say a lot about that race.
Sure.
And if that goes well, and we look at our legislature and we get behind a governor Governor Gavin Newsom, who, let's face it, he's doing a magnificent job given the circumstances we're in. If we continue to get behind him and not be so bent for, the things that he doesn't do for us, understanding, everything that we're battling, I think we can continue to have further successes if we come together, though, if we fight alongside together, because I honestly believe that, what's next for me is continuing to bring people together,
Sure.
because at the heart of criminal justice reform, it's not about, changing the hearts and minds of people who already believe in it. It's about changing the hearts and minds of people who don't believe in criminal justice reform. And if we can't come together and provide them an example of what that looks like, then we're in trouble. And so my hope is that, I continue to fight alongside folks like you and all my brothers and sisters together, even though we disagree, because I know that on the other side of that disagreement, we're going to continue to fight to make sure that this is about public safety for everyone and not just for a certain few.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, brother. And we appreciate your leadership and all the work that you've done. I look up to you. You're a mentor of mine. Continue to press and do the work that you're doing and bringing people together and bridging that gap so that way we can have some successes in the future. I'm Ken Oliver. This has been the Policy Hour with Michael Mendoza. We appreciate your time. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Prison Post, a production of the Crop Organization. We'll be sharing more stories from the world of prison reform and restorative justice, so please join us. You can listen to The Prison Post on all major podcasting platforms. Subscribe to our video cast on YouTube and like us on Facebook at The Prison Post and at Creating Restorative Opportunities and Programs.